The validity that you're looking for is found within you being the most authentic version of yourself that you can be.
Welcome to Graying Rainbows, the podcast community for people coming out LGBT plus later in life. I'm your host, Dr. Ginger Campbell. Wherever you are on your journey, I hope this podcast will help you feel less alone. Today's guest is Rae McDaniel from PracticalAudacity.com. Rae is a therapist and coach who helps people of all ages with gender transition, with an emphasis on positivity and growth. Unfortunately, because Apple Podcasts has very strict rules for maintaining a clean rating, we had to bleep the name of her coaching model. If you want to learn more, please check out the show notes at grayingrainbows.com for links to her websites. Before I share today's interview, I want to remind you that you can find more episodes of Graying Rainbows at grayingrainbows.com, and also you can subscribe for free in your favorite podcasting app, as well as about any app that gives you music, such as Spotify, Pandora, and Amazon Music. You can also get show notes automatically via our newsletter. Just text the word Graying Rainbows, all one word, to 33777. Spell graying with an A. That's Graying Rainbows, all one word, to 33777. I'd love to hear from you. You can send me email at grayingrainbows@gmail.com. Also, there's a Graying Rainbows fan page on Facebook. So, Rae, it's great to have you on Graying Rainbows today. I think you're in Chicago. Is it still winter there?
Chicago cannot make up its mind. It was 80 a couple days ago, and today it's 40 and raining. So who knows? But I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for taking the time to talk with me today. Would you like to just start out by just telling us a little bit about your own story?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to. So the beginning of it might sound a little strange. So I'm the adopted child of evangelical Southern Baptist missionary puppeteers from the deep South, Louisiana to be exact. And so I grew up rather strangely. I grew up on the road. I spent 5 years living in various motels and trailers and motorhomes. And I knew I was different, but I didn't know why. I think at the time, because I was so steeped in evangelical culture, I just wasn't able to see past that and wasn't even in my brain to question my sexuality or my gender identity. Then I went to college at a little tiny liberal arts college in East Texas. And I started becoming friends with the kids that I resonated on the college campus with, which happened to be the theater kids. So I was the kid who was always in the theater building and I didn't quite know why. Like people would ask me why I was there. I'm like, I don't know. I like it here. I feel safe here. And it happened to be that a lot of the theater kids came out as gay over the 4 years that I knew them. And I watched them come out in this super oppressive environment where you could literally get kicked out for being out as gay on the campus. So it was a scary time. And I watched them navigate coming out to very unsupportive families and navigating dating in a culture where you had to be super secretive about it. And I realized that I wanted to work with the LGBTQ community and I love psychology. So I started really getting into psychology in undergrad. I also, as part of my story, I got married when I was 18 to my best friend. It was part of both my family's culture and the culture of the South to get married early. I was a little earlier than most everybody else, but still. So I found out that I wanted to work in psychology, wanted to work with the LGBTQ population, but I still really didn't really understand my own identity at the time. So I went off to grad school in Chicago and I finally felt like I could breathe. I remember driving along in the U-Haul along Lakeshore Drive and blasting music and just feeling like I could take a breath for the first time in my life. And so within a few months of moving to Chicago and starting grad school, I had came out as queer to my friends from college, none of which were surprised. In fact, it was very anticlimactic. A lot of them were like, "Oh, we thought you were already out. Sorry." They were super supportive. And within a year, I had also gotten a divorce from my husband, which was really difficult. He was my best friend since I was a kid, really. But he was also supportive, and we still have a really good relationship. So as I came out in Chicago, discovering my identity, I was diving more of my work into working with the LGBTQ population. So after grad school, I immediately got a job at an LGBTQ counseling agency and was there for about 5 years. And along the way, after grad school, I also came out to my parents, and that did not go as well. In fact, it went pretty terribly. I came out to my mom on a phone call. She didn't really say much. And then I followed it up with an email. And I got an email back that basically just listed a lot of Bible verses and said, love the sinner, hate the sin, which to me, at least in my own life, is not really how love works. When I tried to talk about it on the phone, my dad grabbed the phone away and yelled at me to stay away from his wife and his family and threatened to get a restraining order against me. Luckily, like I said, I already had a really great community of supportive people, just my general community and also where I worked. So I had a bunch of support during this time, but it was still really difficult. And since then, I've put a lot of distance between me and most of my family. There are a couple of exceptions, some cool cousins in there, um, but I put up a lot of boundaries to protect myself that are still up now.
How many years has that been?
That was probably about 2015. So it's been 7 years, maybe a little earlier, 7 or 8 years, something like that.
Yeah, the reason I ask is because that a lot of listeners, I'm sorry, a lot of guests I've talked to have talked about how things evolve over time. And it sounds like from what you're saying, that relationship is still stuck in limbo.
It is. They are very, very conservative and very evangelical. I would say fundamentalist. So that I don't know if it's going to change. We'll see. I hope it does, but I really don't have much hope for it, honestly. Along the way, after I came out as queer, I started questioning my gender identity as well. And this has been a little bit more recent. I would say maybe in the last 4 or 5 years, I've started, and it was a slow process, very, very slow for me. I realized that actually having worked with trans people professionally for quite a while, and the way that I like to describe it felt like a shoe that was a size or half a size too small. I could walk around in it fine for a while, but after a time, it started having blisters. It started being hard to work. I felt very constrained and squished. And coming out as non binary and using they, them pronouns felt like I was finally putting a shoe on that was the right size. I felt like I could breathe. I felt like I had more space to be myself. And it's an identity that really resonates with me. Female identity felt fine for a very long time in my life, but a certain point, it didn't really feel like it fit anymore. And a male identity also didn't feel like it fit. I fit very much in the middle. So I went on over the past, I would say 3-ish years, 3, 4 maybe, of changing my name to Rae. I started using they, them pronouns. I started testosterone and also got top surgery within the past few months, actually, in December of 2020, which is really exciting.
So, do you know Geraldine Stein's book? I think I may have gotten her first name wrong.
What's the book called?
Arlene Stein, sorry. The name of the book is Unbound. It's a really nice book about, and she was on the show several year or two ago. She went down to Florida to a place where one of the top surgeons is, and she basically met 4 kids with different stories and then followed them for a year.
Wow. I haven't heard of that. I will definitely check that out.
Yeah, it's called Unbound: Transgender Men and the Remaking of Identity by Arlene Stein.
Yeah, I will definitely check that out. I know that I was influenced quite a bit by Jeanette Winterson's memoir, Why Be Happy When You Could Be Normal. It's about an adopted kid of a very abusive mother who came out as a lesbian later in her life. And well, maybe not later, I should reread it, but came out and it not going well with her adopted family and then finding her biological family. It's a great read.
What did you say the name of that was?
Why Be Happy When You Can Be Normal by Jeanette Winterson.
I think I've seen that on Amazon. As an older person, one of my problems is that so many of the books are from a very young point of view that I can't really resonate with.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
That's one reason why I do this show, is that people who are mature sometimes feel like there's no resources out there for us, except for Karen Strock's book and Lauren Olson's book. There's not that much out there for people who are older. So I'm trying to fill that gap. Okay, so keep on going. I'm sorry I interrupted you there.
Oh, that's okay.
So you just had your top surgery, and that was a big step.
That was a huge step, and it happened a lot quicker than I thought it was going to. I kind of made up my mind early to mid 2020, and I thought the waiting list was going to be super long, and it wasn't. So I got in pretty quickly, which was fun.
Let me ask you a question that's very personal for me. As a person who grew up before there was a such thing as transgender, and there's a chapter in Arlene's book called The Last Butch Standing, which,
Yeah.
is kind of like, what about so many women who would have been called butch in the day are now coming out as transgender and making decisions to transition in various ways? Did you go through a struggle where you were like, it sounds like you did, but for me, I'm pretty sure that I don't have any gender dysphoria, even though, I was a tomboy and I love dressing in non-feminine ways. Someone told me that I was a soft butch. I was like, okay, whatever. But are we going to be sort of like the weirdos where now it's the normal thing in the community that if you're at all masculine of gender, you're expected to transition?
I hope not, because I think that would be a mistake. Gender identity is really about who you are on the inside. It's about how you feel about your gender expression, meaning how you express that gender to the world can vary. And it may or may not match up with society's expectations for your assigned sex at birth. So I am all for people who identify as female expressing their gender however they want to. Female doesn't mean frilly or dresses or heels. You get to decide what that means for yourself. And I think we're really doing a disservice if we say anybody who expresses themselves as masculine of center is automatically trans or non binary.
And I really worry about that little kids being labeled that way, especially tomboys.
Yeah. Most kids will express how they feel about their gender at a fairly young age.
That's a normal part of be 3 or 4 years old. You're like obsessed with, is that a boy or a girl? That may be partly cultural, but it also seems to be hardwired.
Discovering gender, I think, is hardwired. What kids are defining as male or female, I think, is more cultural. And I will say, too, I'm not an expert on kids or people under the age of 18. I only work with adults, but there are a lot of experts out there who can speak a lot more about kids' identity development. But the current guidelines and my understanding are that kids aren't being given HRT at a very young age. Likely, they would be put on hormone blockers when they're close to puberty, and that just gives them an opportunity to pause puberty and decide for themselves. And usually, hormones are coming after they turn 18, and surgeries generally are coming after they turn 18. Now, there are exceptions. There are kids who really know, or teenagers who have a very firm sense of their identity, and professionals are gonna be able to help them with that and help them really discover who they are.
Unfortunately, I live in Alabama where there is, like many states in the country right now, a bill before our state legislature to ban medical treatment to trans youth. That is just so wrong.
It's so wrong, and this year, 2021, is a landmark year for anti-trans legislation. It is wild what we are seeing out there.
Yeah, it's very upsetting. But okay, so let's get back on track. I'm sorry. Back to your story. I'm going to talk about your work, but I do want to give you a chance to finish your story.
Those are the main components of my personal story. I'm also very lucky that I have a really amazing chosen family here in Chicago and all over the world that are super supportive. I run my own business, so obviously that's supportive of me and anybody else's gender or sexual orientation. And I also have a very supportive partner. So I count myself to be very privileged in those ways.
I'm glad that's going for you because we all have our ups and downs. Some people it's the family, some people it's other things. Me, I'm waiting for COVID to actually be over so I can actually maybe find a partner. But anyhow, okay, so you want to talk about your work and take us through how you ended up to become your own business owner person?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I said, I started out grad school wanting to work with the LGBTQ population. So, I really focused all of my work on that and started working with that population immediately upon graduation. So, I have at this point about 8 years of experience ish working with the LGBTQ population. But along the way, pretty early on in my career, I discovered that I was particularly good at working with the trans and non binary population and helping people through transition. Along the way, I also discovered that so many of my clients were coming to me with sex and sexuality related concerns. And there wasn't as much information as I would like out there for my clients. And so I decided to become an expert in sex and sexuality. So I went back to school. I got my certified sex therapist accreditation, which is a pretty intense accreditation to get as a therapist. And then about 3 years ago, I decided to start my own practice in Chicago called Practical Audacity. And Practical Audacity is niched into the gender and sex therapy world, but generally is a queer affirming place that we want to be safe for queer folks, trans folks, and other marginalized identities. And then about 2 years ago at this point, I started putting together what I call the Genderfck model. And the model came from me being really frustrated that the only thing that I was seeing out there about gender transition was all focused on the things that were really difficult, that were challenging, that were anxiety provoking. And it is very real that there are so many barriers out there for trans folks, both culturally and bureaucratically and medically. It's a huge gatekeeping problem. So, all of those things are true. And the more I worked with folks, the more I was realizing that I was becoming obsessed with the question of how can we make transition easier? How can we make it less anxiety provoking and also bring in joy and curiosity and self growth into that narrative? So I looked at everything that we had in psychology that I knew of around resiliency, around strength based coping, positive psychology. And I started putting it together with things that were also kind of outside of psychology. So, not completely. Mindfulness is talked about a lot in psychology, but I brought in mindfulness. I brought in things like SMART goals and human centered design, which is also a really interesting way of thinking about problems from a human design perspective. So, I was bringing all of that in, and I created the Genderfck model, which has three key pillars that are play, pleasure, and possibility. And under those three key pillars, I have 9 modules that help people walk through each of the main concepts with actual research, with skills, with positive psychology that also doesn't ignore people's feelings or do the love and light thing where we're doing that toxic positivity. No, we want to sit with the difficult things and acknowledge that they are there, acknowledge that, as Emily Nagoski puts in Burnout, the game is rigged, which can actually be a place of a lot of empowerment, and help people walk through transition as a narrative of self discovery and self growth, and with more boundaries and more agency. And the container that I created for the model is called Genderfck the Club. So it's an online group coaching program that houses a 10-week course on the model, and it has every other week coaching with me and some really fun extras. Like we have a book club and we have a gender euphoria social time, and we have various experts that come in occasionally and do workshops. And it's just a really fantastic online community of people.
And since it's online, it doesn't matter where you live.
Exactly. That was part of my process behind developing it because I grew up in the deep South, right? You're in Alabama. There are lots of areas that don't have local access to great LGBTQ affirming care. So I'm a coach there because you can't do therapy across state lines unless you're licensed in that state. But it allows me to work with people all over the United States and all over the world. I've had people from multiple countries who have worked with me.
So, what's the oldest person that you've worked with so far?
In my therapy, I would say 65 to 70. And in the group coaching program, I believe mid to late 50s, something like that.
Yeah, and that's the skew of the online world.
Yep, absolutely. I do tend to work with a lot of people that are established. So people in their 30s, their 40s, their 50s who are coming out a little later in their life.
And would you say that's more common for people transitioning or realizing they're trans? Just because it seems like, at least for women, a lot of us go through the lesbian identity on the way. Of course, that's partly because we were given this model of black and white, right?
Yep. I think that more people are coming out now because there's more education about trans and non binary identities. There's more media featuring trans and non binary identities. And we have some of these bigger name stars that have come out in the past few years: Laverne Cox, Caitlyn Jenner, Janet Mock. We have these people now who are in the public eye that just weren't there before. And so I think people are slowly realizing their identities as it becomes more part of the cultural conversation.
So, when you reflect on the people you've worked with, is there anything that stands out for you that's different, say, if a person's in their 30s as opposed to, say, their late 40s?
Yeah, I think there are some things that are different. One thing, which is a pretty key thing, and it's not only in the older population, I see this also in the younger population, some, but not quite as much, is a really big emphasis on binary gender identity. So male or female and not non binary or somewhere in the middle, and a huge emphasis on passing, or what I like to call blending. And it's really freeing for my clients to realize that they actually have a choice, that they don't have to fit into the mold of male or female. A lot of them, I think, are putting a lot of pressure on themselves to fit squarely within very traditionally masculine or very traditionally feminine, when those ways of being don't really fit for them. Maybe it's a trans woman who doesn't wanna wear dresses and heels and makeup every day and wear your hair long, and that's fine. Or a masculine person, a trans masculine person who doesn't wanna grow a beard and still wants to have certain things about them that are still feminine. That gives a lot more freedom and choice to people, I think. And I also think that this narrative of passing as being the only way to validate your identity is really damaging. There's nothing wrong with wanting to pass. And in a lot of cases, especially in the South, we know that it's safer for especially trans women to pass because there is a lot of violence directed towards trans women, especially trans women of color. And if passing with a stranger on the street or your grocery store clerk is how you get your internal sense of identity and validity, that's setting you up to fail. Because in my experience, passing really has a lot less to do with them, the trans person, and more to do with the person in front of them who is misgendering them or calling them the wrong name.
And here's the thing about being older. I get called sir all the time. And what it tells me is they don't look at us. Women past a certain age are invisible. And so it's not so much it's misgendering, but it's really about not being seen, about being invisible. All they've done is barely looked at you from the periphery and said, oh, this person is short hair and is not short, therefore it's a guy.
Yeah. I love the phrase that you just used about being seen. And I think that's it. And that's what I tell my clients is being seen and being known for who you are is something that for most everybody only comes with your tight knit group of people. That doesn't mean that other people might not gender you correctly and that might not feel good. That's great. And Brene Brown talks about it as your sticky note people. Who are the people in your life that you really love, that love you, that accept you for who you are, no matter what you look like? Those are the people to have in your corner.
And as we get older, if we don't come to appreciate that, that's how women in particular in our culture get obsessed with trying to continue to look young, because we all know that's only people that men see. So if your whole identity has been around your beauty, you get to a certain age and all of a sudden you have no identity.
Yep, exactly.
I mean, I think those of us who are never beautiful are actually ahead of the game. Do you have any stories that you'd like to share with us that you think would help my listeners?
Let me think about that for a second. Because I'm also having to consider client
Right, I
confidentiality. So
understand.
what can I share? I think this might be a good story, and I apologize if I'm going slow. I'm editing as I go here. I had a client who grew up very religious and was involved with their church and actually worked at the church in an administrative position and knew that the church would not be affirming of them as a trans woman and couldn't afford to lose the job because they were in their 60s. They'd worked this job for 20 years, and finding another job would be really difficult at their age. And they also really valued their church community. So, what we worked on was that internal sense of validity, like you're saying, of who are the people that you can find that will see you and know you for who you are, even though you can't be out in every context of your life, including maybe your neighborhood because members of your church might see you, or at work, at the church. So we worked on what does success look like for you? And you asked what's different about older generations. And I think one of the things I see is success in gender transition is often meant to be okay, you've had all the surgeries that you want to. And usually this means bottom surgery as well in this narrative. And you've been on HRT and you pass, 100% of the time, or at least like 98% of the time, and you've now completed transition, right? I'm using air quotes here. And now you are successful. And really, I think success, and this is what I talked about with this client, success is being able to walk around as your most authentic self in as many areas of your life as are safe for you. And in this case, it was not safe for this client to be walking around in their neighborhood or to be going to their job at the church. So we worked on how can you express your gender in more subtle ways. So this might look different for different people. This might look like wearing women's underwear or wearing a sports bra underneath their clothing, especially if you're starting HRT and you have chest growth or breast growth. Wearing a binder or a sports bra can be a really great way to do that at work without needing to come out. Maybe this looks like painting your nails or wearing clothing that's from the women's section but is neutral, like jeans or like a knit top or something like that, is really androgynous and can kind of go either way, but you know what you're wearing. The other thing I talk about is how can you express what you view as femininity in your values and your attitudes and how you show up wherever you are. So that might look like being a good listener. That might look like really caring for the people around you in a deep way. That might look like being fiercely femme in a way that you can get away with. Femininity means different things to different people, but how can you live out your values and the person that you want to be in how you show up with others and in how you show up with yourself? I've also had clients like this one who found a lot of joy in developing hobbies or interests that are traditionally more feminine. So maybe that's baking, maybe that's taking a pottery class, things that people who were assigned male at birth are often not given cultural permission to do. Another thing that I did with this client is we identified some areas where they could go and be themselves that wasn't their neighborhood. So they did a lot of both staying in their home and having dinner dressed however they want to dress. And in this case, as very feminine, wearing their wig, putting on makeup, wearing a dress, and do that with trusted friends in your own home. Have a dinner party. That felt really good for them. Another thing that we did was finding other spaces outside of the home that were safe that they could go to. So luckily, they lived in a big city, so they were able to go to other places in the city that were far away and go to trans-centered events or other events that they knew would be safe. LGBTQ events at the LGBTQ center. They were also able to find some friends who didn't live in the city, who lived, I think, a couple hours or so outside of the city. And they could go and spend a week with these friends, completely presenting the way that they wanted to. And for them, that was enough. They were able to come out to the people in their life that they were close to certain family members that they were close to, and able to keep their job at the church and their community at the church. And that is what made them feel valid and seen for who they were.
Rae, I really like that story because it demonstrates a truth that seems I get from every single guest on the show, which is there's no one size fits all way of doing this journey.
There's definitely not. This can look any way that you want, and there is no end point, right? The end point of gender transition is you just growing into more of who you are. I view it as self actualization and self growth. And I don't think any of us ever really land at the end point of self growth or self actualization.
What about finding intimate partners?
That's a really big one. And it can be challenging. I'm going to be real with you. I think for any older person, finding a partner is a challenging thing. And depending on where you live, it can be extra challenging if you are trans. What I do see that I want to challenge is this idea of trans folks of any age, but especially older ages, feel that they can't find a partner or they have to accept what they can get as a trans person, which usually means a partner that really doesn't feel good, that maybe doesn't treat them well, or somebody who is I want to be careful saying this because some people enjoy relationships or sexual relationships with people that are considered what the community would call chasers. And I won't use the pejorative term there, but you don't have to have a sexual relationship or romantic relationship with someone who doesn't treat you well. There are people out there who will see you for who you are and treat you well, and that you can have amazing sexual relationships with. A lot of times that is found by maybe going out of your comfort zone a little bit. It might mean if you're in an area that has trans or queer or LGBTQ events, going to some of those. It might be signing up for a dating site. Whether you identify yourself as heterosexual, as a trans person, or queer, there are places where you can find partners that are going to support you. It just might take a little bit more work and being very clear on what your boundaries are and what your needs are in a relationship. It also might require traveling in some cases.
At what point do people generally reveal that they're trans? I would guess that if you were starting a relationship and you didn't reveal this up front, it would cause trouble down the road. So, how do you handle that issue?
Different people have different ways of handling this. And I do not want to in any way say that going stealth, if you will, in a relationship is not okay in any circumstance. I think there are circumstances where it makes sense to maybe come out a little bit later in the dating process. That's a very personal choice. However, what I see with my clients and in my experience, putting that up front as soon as possible helps you, the trans person, weed out people that are not going to be worth your time. And I think a lot of people view it as, oh, I'm sharing this thing that a bunch of people aren't going to like, and it's going to put me out of the running. And I have to come out later so they get to know me as a person before making that decision. And I get that. Then you have to go on several dates with a person who isn't ultimately going to be affirming of you. And I just don't think that's worth your time. So I really advocate putting that front and center.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I haven't really thought about this very much, but I think that if I met somebody that I really was attracted to, I wouldn't care. But I would appreciate honesty.
Yeah, absolutely. I think part of the discussion here is about dysphoria around genitals specifically. We know that is such a thing in the trans community, not for everybody, but for a lot of people. And my friend and colleague Lucy Fielding is putting out a book for clinicians. It's by Routledge. It's coming out in May called Trans Sex. And in it, she talks about what she calls imaginal failures, which I really love, of how we use our bodies, of assuming that because we have a internal or external genitalia, that we have to use that in certain ways. There are a million ways that we can use our bodies, but we get stuck in this idea of These are the roles and these are the sex acts that I have to do as somebody who identifies as a woman or somebody who identifies as a man. And I think I call it queering it up. We can really expand our imagination and curiosity about ways that we can engage with each other.
This has been a really good conversation and really thought provoking. Is there anything else you'd like to share before we close?
If I could share one thing with your audience that I would like them to take away, I would say that gender transition is something to be celebrated. Yes, there are barriers in it. That's true. It can be hard. Yes, absolutely. It's intense. Yep. And it can be a place of a lot of joy and pleasure and curiosity. The validity that you're looking for is found within you, you being the most authentic version of yourself that you can be.
I appreciate Rae McDaniel coming on Grain Rainbows to share her unique vision about making gender transition a positive experience and an opportunity for growth. If you want to learn more about her work, please see the show notes for this episode for the links. These show notes appear in your podcasting app, but you can also find them along with more episodes of Grain Rainbows at grainrainbows.com. And be sure to subscribe for free in your favorite audio app, whether it's podcasting app or Amazon Music, Audible, Pandora, and Spotify. Anywhere you can listen to music, now you can just about get podcasts, including Grain Rainbows. If you'd like to get show notes automatically, you can sign up for our free newsletter by texting Grain Rainbows to 33777. Grain Rainbows, all one word, spelled with an A, to 33777. I'll be back next month with another episode. Until then, please check out my other podcasts, Brain Science and Books and Ideas. Grain Rainbows is copyright 2021 to Dr. Virginia Campbell. You may copy it to share it with others, but for any other uses or derivatives, please contact me at grainrainbows@gmail.com.